Hello, everyone. I am the Midnight Narrator. I know you use this video to fall asleep to, so before that, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Close your eyes and let the sound of the ocean carry you away. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of The Listening House. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The keys felt heavier than they should have in Sarah Chen's palm as she stood before the Victorian house on Elm Street. The brass was tarnished black, and the teeth were worn smooth from decades of use. She'd driven 12 hours from Portland to reach this forgotten corner of rural Oregon, following GPS directions that had grown increasingly uncertain as cell towers became sparse and the roads narrowed to single lanes carved between towering Douglas firs. The house loomed before her, 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding and Gothic revival details that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from the trim like old skin, and several shutters hung askew on rusted hinges. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect, its ornate gingerbread trim casting intricate shadows in the late afternoon light. Sarah had never met her great-aunt Millicent, but the woman's death had made her the sole heir to this property. The lawyer's letter had been brief and formal, mentioning only that Millicent Chen had passed peacefully in her sleep, and that Sarah was to inherit the house and its contents. No other family members were mentioned. No friends. No one else had claimed the body. The front door was painted a deep burgundy that had faded to the color of dried blood. Sarah inserted the larger key and turned it with some effort. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking bones. The interior was a time capsule from the 1940s, though Sarah suspected some of the furniture dated back even further. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the natural light, leaving the rooms in a perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she moved through the front hall. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track her movement. She recognized none of the faces, though she thought she caught a resemblance in the sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to run in the Chen family line. The living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its mantel crowded with photographs and curiosities. Sarah approached for a closer look and found herself studying image after image of the same woman at different ages. A stern-faced woman with prematurely gray hair and those familiar dark eyes. Millicent, she assumed. But it was the other objects on the mantel that gave her pause. There were small glass vials filled with what looked like herbs or dried flowers, their contents labeled in spidery handwriting she couldn't quite make out. A collection of smooth stones, each carved with symbols that weren't quite letters and weren't quite pictures. And in the center of it all, a large brass bell, its surface green with verdigris. Sarah reached for the bell, curious about its weight and craftsmanship, but stopped when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the floor above. She froze, her hand extended toward the bell, and listened. The sound came again, the unmistakable creak of old floorboards under weight. Someone was walking around upstairs. "Hello?" she called out, her voice smaller than she intended. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Sarah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, but heard nothing more. After several minutes, she convinced herself it had been the house settling, or perhaps an animal that had gotten inside through a broken window or damaged section of roof. She spent the next hour exploring the ground floor, taking inventory of what she'd inherited. The kitchen was a museum piece of vintage appliances and hand-painted cabinets, though everything appeared to be in working order. The dining room table could seat 12, its surface scarred by decades of use but still solid. A small library off the main hall contained hundreds of books, many in languages Sarah didn't recognize. As evening approached, she decided to tackle the second floor. The stairs were solid oak, worn smooth in the center from generations of footsteps. Each step groaned under her weight, announcing her ascent to the shadows above. The upstairs hallway ran the length of the house, with doors leading off to various bedrooms and what appeared to be a small study. All the doors were closed except one at the far end of the hall, which stood slightly ajar. Sarah approached it cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet with each step. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the house. When she reached the door, she pushed it open slowly. It was clearly Millicent's bedroom. The bed was still made, though the covers showed the impression of a body that had lain there recently. A vanity table sat against one wall, its mirror reflecting Sarah's pale face back at her in the dim light. Bottles of perfume and jars of cream cluttered the surface, and a silver hairbrush lay beside them, still tangled with strands of gray hair. But it was the walls that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Every inch of available wall space was covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all connected by lengths of red yarn like some mad conspiracy theorist's web. She moved closer to examine the display and realized it was a timeline of sorts, a chronicle of disappearances dating back nearly 50 years. Missing persons flyers were pinned next to yellowed newspaper headlines. Local woman vanishes without trace. Search continues for missing hiker. Police baffled by third disappearance this year. The photographs showed faces of all ages: children, teenagers, young adults, elderly people. What connected them wasn't immediately clear, but Sarah noticed that many of the disappearances had occurred within a 50-mile radius of this very house. At the center of the web, larger than all the rest, was a photograph of Millicent herself. She looked younger in the picture, perhaps in her 40s, and she was standing in front of this house. But she wasn't alone. There were other figures in the photograph, shadowy forms that seemed to hover just at the edges of the frame, as if they were only partially visible when the picture was taken. Sarah leaned closer, trying to make out the details of these shadow figures, when she heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from directly above her head, from the third floor. She looked up at the ceiling, following the sound as it moved from one end of the room to the other. Slow, measured steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the room above. Sarah had assumed the third floor was an attic, probably accessible only by a ladder or pull-down stairs. But as she stood there listening to the deliberate footsteps, she realized there must be actual rooms up there. Rooms where someone, or something, was walking around. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Sarah held her breath, waiting. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, without warning, there came a single sharp rap on the ceiling. Then another, and another. Knock, knock, knock. Whatever was up there was knocking back at her. Sarah backed away from the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The knocking continued, 3 sharp raps repeated over and over, following her as she moved. When she reached the doorway, the knocking stopped. She didn't wait to see what might happen next. She turned and ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back. The hallway was empty, but she could feel something watching her from the shadows. Downstairs, Sarah tried to calm herself with rational explanations. Old houses made noises. Pipes settled. Wood expanded and contracted. The knocking could have been anything. A loose shutter banging in the wind, a tree branch scraping against the roof. But even as she told herself these things, she knew they weren't true. The footsteps had been too regular, too purposeful, and the knocking had followed her movement exactly, as if something was tracking her from above. She spent the evening in the kitchen, making tea with supplies she'd brought, and trying to plan her next steps. The obvious thing would be to have the house inspected and put it on the market immediately. She lived in Portland, had a job there, a life there. What did she need with a creepy old house in the middle of nowhere? But even as she made these practical plans, she found herself drawn back to the wall of photographs in Millicent's room. All those missing people, all those unsolved disappearances. What had her great-aunt been investigating? And why had she documented it all so obsessively? As night fell, Sarah realized she hadn't brought enough supplies for an extended stay. She'd planned to spend one night, assess the property, and drive back to Portland the next day. But now she found herself curious about the house's secrets, despite her fear. She decided to explore the 3rd floor. Chapter 2. The 3rd floor. Finding the entrance to the 3rd floor took longer than Sarah expected. There was no obvious staircase on the 2nd floor, and she spent nearly an hour opening every door and checking every closet before she found it. The door was hidden behind a tapestry at the end of the hallway, so well concealed that she might have missed it entirely if she hadn't noticed the slight gap between the fabric and the wall. When she pulled the tapestry aside, she found a narrow wooden door, painted the same dark green as the hallway walls. The door was locked, but one of the keys on the ring fit perfectly. As she turned it, Sarah wondered why anyone would lock access to their own attic. What was up there that Millicent had wanted to keep secure? The staircase beyond the door was narrow and steep, barely wide enough for one person. The steps were uncarpeted wood, and each one creaked ominously under Sarah's weight. She used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the way, though the pale LED light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than pushing it back. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a small landing with 3 doors. Unlike the rest of the house, these doors were made of heavy oak and fitted with substantial locks. Sarah tried her keys systematically until she found the ones that fit. The first room was set up as a study, but unlike the cozy library downstairs, this space felt more like a research laboratory. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Every surface was covered with papers, photographs, maps, and notebooks, filled with Millicent's spidery handwriting. Sarah approached the desk and began examining the documents. What she found made her stomach clench with unease. Millicent hadn't just been documenting disappearances. She'd been tracking them, mapping them, trying to find patterns. The maps were covered with colored pins marking locations where people had vanished, red pins for confirmed disappearances, yellow pins for suspected cases, blue pins for locations where people had reported unusual experiences but hadn't actually disappeared. The pins formed a rough circle around the house, with the highest concentration within a 5-mile radius. Some of the files contained detailed profiles of the missing persons, including their last known locations, the circumstances of their disappearances, and any witness reports. But others contained information that made Sarah's blood run cold. There were audio recordings, dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with a date and a set of initials. Sarah found an old tape player on a shelf and, with trembling hands, inserted one of the tapes. The label read, MW-July 15th, 1987. Static filled the room. Then a voice emerged from the speakers. It was a woman's voice, young and frightened. Is anyone there? Please, I know someone can hear me. I've been calling for help for days now. I don't know where I am. It's dark, and I can't find a way out. The walls feel like they're moving. The voice continued for several minutes, growing increasingly panicked. The woman described being trapped in what sounded like a maze of corridors, hearing footsteps that followed her but never quite caught up, seeing lights that disappeared whenever she approached them. Near the end of the recording, the woman's voice changed. The panic was replaced by something else, a dreamy, almost hypnotic quality. I understand now, she said. I can hear them calling to me. They've been so lonely, waiting so long. I need to join them. I need to become part of the pattern. The recording ended with a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. A low, harmonious humming, as if multiple voices were singing together just at the edge of hearing. Sarah ejected the tape with shaking hands and selected another one. This one was labeled JR-10/3/1992. The voice was different, a man this time, older, but the story was eerily similar. He described being lost in a place that defied geometry, where corridors led in circles and doors opened onto rooms that couldn't possibly exist in the space available. And at the end, the same transformation, the same dreamy acceptance, the same haunting harmony of voices. Sarah went through several more tapes, and each one followed the same pattern. Different voices, different years, but always the same progression from fear to confusion to a kind of hypnotic surrender. She was about to close the player when she noticed one more tape sitting separate from the others. The label was different. Instead of initials and a date, it simply read, Millicent, final recording. Sarah hesitated. Whatever was on this tape, it was her great-aunt's last words. but she had to know. She inserted the tape and pressed play. Millicent's voice filled the room, clearer and more present than the others. She sounded tired but determined. This is my final recording. I've spent 30 years documenting the disappearances, trying to understand what's happening in this place. I know now that I was wrong about many things, but I was right about the most important one. This house is the center of something ancient and hungry. Sarah leaned closer to the speaker, straining to catch every word. The people who disappeared didn't leave this place. They're still here, in the spaces between spaces, in the rooms that exist alongside our own, but just slightly displaced. They've become part of something larger, something that feeds on human consciousness and uses it to maintain its existence. Millicent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I can feel it calling to me now, the way it called to all the others. The walls are getting thinner. The boundaries between what is and what might be are breaking down. I've been fighting it for so long, but I'm tired now. So very tired. There was a long pause, filled only with the soft hiss of the tape. Sarah, if you're listening to this, it means the house has passed to you. You have the choice I never had. You can leave. You can walk away and never come back. But if you stay, if you try to understand what I've spent my life studying, you need to know the truth. Another pause, longer this time. The house doesn't just contain whatever is here. The house is whatever is here. Every board, every nail, every brick is part of a larger consciousness that has been growing for over a century. It feeds on the people who enter it, slowly absorbing them into its structure. And once you become part of it, you can never truly leave. Sarah felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. I made a deal, Millicent continued. I agreed to document its feeding, to help it select the right kind of people. Those who wouldn't be missed, those who were already isolated and forgotten. In exchange, it allowed me to maintain my independence, to keep my own thoughts and memories. But the deal is ending now. I can feel myself being absorbed, becoming part of the pattern. The tape crackled with static, and when Millicent's voice returned, it sounded different, more distant, as if she were speaking from far away. The key is in the bell, the brass bell on the mantel. It's not just decoration, it's a focus point, a way to communicate with the consciousness that inhabits this place. Ring it once to call its attention. Ring it twice to make an offering. Ring it 3 times. The voice faded into static, then returned one final time. Ring it 3 times to join us. The tape ended. Sarah sat in the silence of the study, processing what she'd heard. Her great-aunt had been documenting disappearances for 30 years, and according to her final recording, she'd been complicit in them. The house itself was some kind of entity that fed on human consciousness, and Millicent had been helping it select victims. And now Sarah was here, alone in the house, with night falling outside. She needed to leave. Immediately. Sarah gathered up several of the most recent files and a handful of tapes, stuffing them into her backpack. Whatever was happening here, whatever the house really was, she wasn't equipped to deal with it alone. She would drive back to Portland tonight, contact the authorities in the morning, and let them figure out what to do with Millicent's evidence. But as she headed for the stairs, she heard something that stopped her cold. The brass bell downstairs was ringing. Chapter 3. The Calling. The bell's sound drifted up through the floors of the house, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's bones. One ring, clear and purposeful, echoing through the rooms below. Sarah froze at the top of the narrow staircase, her hand gripping the railing. According to Millicent's recording, one ring meant the house was calling for attention. But who, or what, had rung it? The sound faded, leaving only silence. Sarah waited, counting seconds, but the bell didn't ring again. Slowly, quietly, she began descending the stairs, her phone's flashlight beam dancing ahead of her. Every step seemed to echo despite her efforts to move silently. At the bottom of the stairs, she pressed her ear to the door that led back to the second-floor hallway. She could hear nothing beyond the normal settling sounds of an old house. Carefully, she turned the handle and opened the door just enough to peer out. The hallway was empty, but something was different. The air felt thicker, more charged, as if a storm were approaching. And there was a smell, something organic and sweet, like the scent she'd noticed when she first entered the house. But stronger now. Sarah crept down the hallway toward the main staircase, pausing at each doorway to listen. The house felt more alive now, more aware of her presence. The shadows seemed deeper, and she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision that disappeared when she turned to look directly. At the top of the main staircase, she could see down into the living room. The fireplace mantel was visible from this angle, and the brass bell sat exactly where she'd first seen it. But now it seemed to gleam with its own light, as if it were warm to the touch. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, her attention fixed on the bell. As she reached the bottom step, she noticed something that made her heart skip. There were wet footprints on the hardwood floor. The prints were small and bare, leading from the front door to the fireplace and back again. They were too small to be hers, and they hadn't been there when she'd gone upstairs. Someone had entered the house while she was in the third-floor study. Sarah followed the trail of footprints, her phone's light revealing more details. The prints were delicate, almost childlike, but the impressions were deep, as if whoever had made them was heavier than their size suggested. Near the fireplace, the trail became confused, with multiple overlapping prints suggesting the visitor had paced back and forth in front of the mantel. The bell sat silent now, but Sarah could see droplets of water on its surface, as if someone with wet hands had recently touched it. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response, but the quality of the silence changed. It became expectant, as if the house itself were listening. Sarah approached the mantel and examined the bell more closely. It was larger than she'd initially thought, about the size of a softball, with intricate engravings covering its surface. The symbols were similar to those she'd seen on the stones, but more elaborate. Interconnected patterns that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. As she studied the engravings, she noticed something else. The vials of herbs and dried flowers on the mantel had been rearranged. When she'd first seen them, they'd been scattered randomly across the surface. Now they were arranged in a precise circle around the bell, with the carved stones placed at regular intervals between them. Someone had been here. Someone had rung the bell and arranged the objects in a specific pattern. But who? And more importantly, where were they now? Sarah backed away from the mantel, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the intruder. The wet footprints led away from the fireplace, but they seemed to fade as they moved toward the center of the room, as if whoever had made them had simply evaporated. That was impossible, of course. People didn't just disappear. But then again, according to Millicent's research, people had been disappearing around this house for decades. Sarah was about to investigate the rest of the ground floor when she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. Children's laughter. It was coming from upstairs, high and sweet and completely innocent. The kind of laughter that should have been comforting, but in the context of this dark house, with its history of disappearances and its inexplicable wet footprints, it was terrifying. The laughter continued for several seconds, then faded into silence. Sarah stood frozen in the living room, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to repeat. When it didn't, she forced herself to move toward the staircase. She climbed slowly, her phone's light sweeping back and forth across the steps. The second-floor hallway looked exactly as she'd left it, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. The shadows seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the air was thick with that sweet, organic smell. Sarah checked each room systematically, but found nothing out of place. Millicent's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it, the wall of photographs and newspaper clippings unchanged. The other rooms were empty, their contents undisturbed. But when she reached the door to the third-floor stairs, she found it standing open. She was certain she'd closed it when she came down. She remembered pulling it shut behind her and hearing the latch click into place. But now it stood wide open, the tapestry pushed aside, revealing the narrow staircase leading up into darkness. Sarah climbed the stairs again, her heart pounding. At the top, she found the door to Millicent's study standing open as well. She was sure she'd closed this one too, but now she doubted her own memory. The stress of the situation was getting to her, making her careless. Inside the study, everything appeared normal. The files and tapes were where she'd left them, the desk undisturbed. But as Sarah swept her phone's light across the room, she noticed something that made her freeze. There was a new tape on the desk. It hadn't been there before. She was certain of it. The tape was newer than the others, its label crisp and white instead of yellowed with age. In Millicent's familiar handwriting, it read simply, "Sarah, welcome home." Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the tape. It was room temperature, but she could swear it felt warm to the touch. She looked at the tape player, then back at the cassette. Every instinct told her not to play it, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She inserted the tape and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the speakers was Millicent's, but it sounded different from the previous recordings. Younger, somehow, and filled with a strange kind of joy. "Hello, Sarah. I knew you would come. I knew you would find your way to the truth." Sarah's breath caught. This recording was meant specifically for her. But how was that possible? Millicent had died weeks ago. You're probably frightened right now, confused by what you've experienced. The footprints, the bell, the laughter. They're all real, Sarah. The house is welcoming you, showing you signs of its presence. It's been waiting for you for a very long time. The voice continued, warm and conversational, as if Millicent were sitting right there in the room with her. You see, the consciousness that inhabits this place doesn't just feed randomly, it's selective, choosing people who have the right kind of sensitivity, the right kind of awareness. People like us, Sarah. People who can perceive the spaces between spaces, who can hear the voices of those who have joined the pattern. Sarah wanted to turn off the tape, but she found herself unable to move. Millicent's voice was hypnotic, drawing her deeper into whatever truth lay at the heart of this house. I spent 30 years fighting it, trying to protect people from it, documenting its feeding patterns so that someone someday might find a way to stop it. But I was wrong, Sarah. I was so wrong. It's not a predator, it's a family. A collective consciousness made up of everyone who has ever truly belonged somewhere. The tape crackled with static, and when Millicent's voice returned, it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The people who disappeared didn't die, Sarah. They found their way home. They joined something larger and more beautiful than individual existence. They became part of a community that transcends physical boundaries, a place where loneliness and isolation are impossible. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, though she couldn't say why. The words were terrifying, but there was something in Millicent's voice, a profound peace and contentment that touched something deep inside her. I know you've been lonely, Sarah. I know you've spent your whole life feeling like you don't quite fit, like you're always on the outside looking in. The house knows this too. It can sense the emptiness inside you, the longing for connection that you've never been able to satisfy. The words hit too close to home. Sarah thought about her apartment in Portland, with its single place settings and lack of personal photographs. Her job at the library, where she worked alone in the basement, cataloging old documents. Her weekends spent reading or taking solitary walks, avoiding the coffee shops and restaurants where other people gathered in groups. You can have that connection now, Sarah. You can become part of something that will never abandon you, never betray you, never leave you alone. All you have to do is ring the bell 3 times and open your heart to the possibility of belonging. The tape ended, leaving Sarah alone in the silence of the study. She sat there for a long time, staring at the cassette player, processing what she'd heard. Part of her knew that she was being manipulated, that whatever was in this house was using her loneliness against her. But another part of her, a part that had been empty and aching for as long as she could remember, was drawn to Millicent's promise of belonging. She thought about the tapes she'd listened to earlier, the voices of the people who had disappeared. They'd all started out frightened and confused, but by the end, they'd sounded peaceful, even happy. What if Millicent was right? What if they'd found something better than the isolated lives they'd left behind? Sarah shook her head. trying to clear away the seductive thoughts. She needed to leave. Now, before whatever was in this house could influence her any further. But as she stood to go, she heard the bell again. 2 rings this time, clear and resonant, echoing through the house. According to Millicent's instructions, 2 rings meant an offering was being made. But what kind of offering? And who was making it? Sarah found herself moving towards the stairs, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. She needed to see what was happening downstairs. She needed to understand what the house was trying to show her. Chapter 4. The Offering. The living room had transformed. Every candle in the house, and there were dozens of them, in holders Sarah hadn't noticed before, was now lit. They cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the portraits seem to move and shift. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and something else, something that reminded Sarah of incense, but with an underlying earthiness that spoke of deep forests and rich soil. The brass bell sat in the center of the mantel, surrounded by the carefully arranged vials and stones. But now there was something else, a photograph that hadn't been there before. Sarah approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she got closer, she could see that the photograph was old, the black and white image slightly blurred with age. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of the house. The girl had dark hair and serious eyes, and she was holding the hand of a woman Sarah recognized as a younger version of Millicent. But it was the inscription on the back of the photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. In faded ink, someone had written, "Sarah Chen, age 9, visiting Aunt Millicent, summer 1997. Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. She had no memory of ever visiting this house, no recollection of meeting Millicent. But the girl in the photograph was unmistakably her. The same dark eyes, the same serious expression she'd worn in her school pictures from that time. How was this possible? How could she have been here before and not remembered it? As she studied the photograph, more memories began to surface, fragments of images and sensations that felt like half-remembered dreams. She recalled a summer when she was 9, when her parents had sent her to stay with a relative she'd never met. She remembered feeling scared and lonely, missing her familiar surroundings. But the details were vague, as if they'd been deliberately obscured. And then she remembered the dreams. For years after that summer, she'd been plagued by recurring nightmares about a dark house with too many rooms, corridors that led nowhere, and voices calling to her from behind closed doors. The dreams had been so vivid that she'd sometimes woken up screaming, but they'd gradually faded as she got older. Now, standing in the living room with the photograph in her hands, she realized they hadn't been dreams at all. They'd been memories. She'd been here before. She'd walked these halls, slept in these rooms, and somehow the house had let her go. But why? And what had changed now that would bring her back? Sarah set the photograph back on the mantel with trembling hands. The candles flickered in response, as if disturbed by an unfelt breeze. In their dancing light, she noticed something else. More photographs, scattered across the mantel and the surfaces of nearby tables. All of them showed her at different ages, in different locations, but always with the same theme. Sarah alone, Sarah reading by herself in the school library. Sarah walking alone through a park. Sarah sitting by herself in a college cafeteria, surrounded by empty chairs. The house had been watching her. For 28 years, it had been documenting her isolation, her loneliness, her inability to form lasting connections with other people. Every photograph was a testament to her solitude, evidence of the emptiness that had defined her entire adult life. And now she understood what the offering was. The house wasn't offering something to her. It was offering her to whatever consciousness dwelt within its walls. It was presenting her life as proof that she belonged here, that she was already one of the lost and forgotten ones it had been collecting for decades. Sarah backed away from the mantel, her heart racing. She needed to leave immediately, before whatever was happening here went any further. But as she turned towards the front door, she found her way blocked. A figure stood in the doorway, translucent and shimmering, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Sarah couldn't make out details, but she could see it was small, childlike in its proportions. As she watched, the figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. More figures began appearing throughout the room. They materialized slowly, like photographs developing in a dark room, becoming more solid and defined with each passing second. Sarah recognized some of them from the missing persons flyers in Millicent's room. A teenage boy with haunted eyes, an elderly woman with gray hair, a young mother who looked barely out of her teens. They were all there, all the people who had disappeared over the decades. But they weren't exactly as they had been in life. There was something ethereal about them, something that suggested they existed in a state between life and death, between presence and absence. The child figure stepped forward, and Sarah could see that it was a little girl, perhaps the same age Sarah had been in that long-forgotten summer visit. The girl's face was familiar, though Sarah couldn't place where she'd seen it before. "You came back," the girl said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through autumn leaves. "We knew you would. We've been waiting so long." Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The girl smiled, and in that smile, Sarah saw something that made her knees weak with recognition. It was her own smile, from her own childhood, preserved in this ghostly figure. "I'm you," the girl said simply. "The part of you that never left this place. The part that understood what was being offered and wanted to stay." Sarah stared at the apparition, trying to process what she was seeing. "That's impossible." "Is it?" The girl stepped closer, and Sarah could see that she cast no shadow in the candlelight. "You remember now, don't you? You remember the summer you came here, how lonely you were, how much you wanted to belong somewhere. The house offered you a choice then, just like it's offering you a choice now." More memories flooded back, sitting in this very room with Millicent, learning about the house's history, feeling the pull of something vast and welcoming in the shadows. She remembered being tempted, being drawn to the promise of never feeling alone again. But she also remembered being afraid, clinging to the familiar, even though it offered her nothing but isolation. "You chose to leave," the girl continued. "You chose to return to a world that would never truly accept you. never truly understand you. But the house let you go because it knew you would come back eventually. It knew that loneliness would drive you home. The other figures began moving closer, forming a circle around Sarah. She could see their faces now, and she recognized the expression they all shared. A profound peace, a contentment that came from finally belonging somewhere completely.